And heck with Flume, I can just cover random stuff like this, you can't tell me what to do. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the 1998 album from Propellerheads, Decksandrumsandrockandroll. You know, my next planned discography review is M83, but before I get into that, I wanted to spring a surprise discography review on you guys with the Propellerheads. The short-lived big beat duo of Alex Gifford and Will White, who were active for a little bit in the mid-late 90s and early 2000s before disbanding in 2003. And this will be a great series for me to do because this one video is the entire series. This album from 1998, Decks and Drums and Rock and Roll, is the only studio album Propellerheads ever released. They had a couple of EPs and loose singles on the side, though pretty much all the rest of their output was included as a bonus second disc for the 20th anniversary reissue in 2018. Save for maybe, like, one or two loose tracks, if that. After 2003, these guys pretty much just disappeared off the map. Will White showed up to play drums on a few Future Sound of London side projects, and was briefly part of a downtempo outfit called Flexitones, which also only released one album in 2004. And Alex Gifford, I don't even know, his credits list pretty much abruptly cuts off right after the Propellerheads disbanded. But they did have this one album, which was a huge hit at the time. Lots of tracks getting used in commercials and movie soundtracks, most notably their track Spybreak, which soundtracked the famous hotel lobby shootout scene in The Matrix. And also History Repeating, which showed up in the soundtrack to the movie There's Something About Mary. These guys often get mentioned in the same context as the likes of Fatboy Slim, the Chemical Brothers, and The Prodigy, with this album frequently held up as a classic on the level of You've Come a Long Way Baby, Dig Your Own Hole, or The Fat of the Land by those who are around to see it, especially if you happen to be British. Now, of course, I'm American and kinda missed the boat on these guys. While they had a couple of hits on this side of the Atlantic, they weren't even close to being as successful here as they were over in their home country, and are probably a lot more overshadowed by their colleagues in the genre I've just mentioned. Spybreak and History Repeating were the only tracks I'd definitively heard from them before. Maybe I'd heard Take California in a commercial or two when I was little, but it was way too long ago for me to remember. And while I'd known about this album since like 2017 or so, when I started to get a bunch of requests to cover it by some former regular commenters, and Oliver from Deep Cuts marked it as an essential album to get into Big Beat, they'd piqued my interest for such a long time, but I only finally got around to hearing this album in its full entirety, like, 2 months ago. And I'll freely admit, it was not love at first listen. And while I do think the core album is very good, I'm not sure if it quite reaches proper greatness as a complete whole. Like, this album took some adjusting to, because like, if you thought Fatboy Slim was a product of the late 90s, it's nothing compared to this project, which might be the most 1998 thing ever to exist. It's so 1998 to the point where it feels almost alien to listen to in 2022. Like, these guys lived in such a different world from the one we live in now. My first full listen of this thing was on a bright sunny day. I went to a Noodles & Company restaurant which had just lifted all its COVID restrictions and was serving people inside the restaurant without masks or anything, fully back to the way it was like in 2019. There was a large group of like 15 teenage girls eating together like right near the front of the restaurant. The track Velvet Pants came on my iPod as I was waiting for my food to come in, and I was genuinely unsettled by the experience. I felt like I'd literally just been transported backwards in time to a completely different era. And it's taken a number of listens for me to adjust to the sheer, unadulterated 90s-ness of it all. The sound, the attitude, the overall aesthetic, the DJ scratches, the samples, the breakbeats, the acid synths, the references to freaking skateboarding culture. Every single little detail about this album, from its production to its overall construction, feels so intrinsically tied to this one specific moment in time. Yeah, this is a weird album to listen to these days. I think it's kind of all over the place quality-wise, and I don't think it's aged nearly as gracefully as those other big beat classics I've mentioned above. Even You've Come a Long Way, Baby, as inherently and infixably late 90s as it is, never gave me that same sense of time whiplash as this one did. But that's obviously not to take away from the best moments sprinkled all over this thing, which are great enough to make the album worth checking out on their own. It is obviously interesting enough for me to have been compelled to make this video in the first place without anyone having requested it in like 3-4 years. The thing about this album is that the best moments on here by far are also the big singles. Take California is an excellent attention-grabbing start to this thing with its deep, grooving bass lines and banging breakbeats, with a couple of spoken samples saying the title and sneaky organ licks, really helping set the tone for the album as a whole with its sort of 60s secret agent movie soundtrack-inspired vibes. And the album's ending, Spybreak, is very much in the exact same mold. Even faster paced and more intense and even more spy movie-like, true to its title. Excellent way to close out the album as well and bookend the whole thing. But while we're on the topic of spy movies, that's also the biggest theme behind the other two most recognizable singles. History Repeating goes for a much more overtly jazzy approach with its instrumentals of punchy brass sections and organs going over the thicker drumming, and even features a vocal appearance from Shirley Bassey. It is trying as hard as it possibly can to sound like their own custom-made James Bond theme. And somehow that's not even the most James Bond-inspired track on here. On Her Majesty's Secret Service directly samples various orchestral pieces that John Barry composed for the Bond movies and turns them into this big 9-minute big beat epic. I was already expecting that one to be my favorite track in the bunch just looking over the track listing before hearing anything, and surprise, it very much was. Although my favorite part is that section in the middle where they sample Capsule in Space, and that primarily got me as excited as it did thanks to CFAX Acid Crew's cover of that piece last year. Like, that's the one moment where listening to this album now instead of, like, 4 years ago really worked to this album's benefit. The other big single I haven't already mentioned is Bang On, the most intense and fast-paced moment in the bunch with crazy live drumming, hyperspeed acid synths, and distorted bass guitars. It goes just as hard as its title implies and is lots of fun. Now, perhaps unfortunately, I don't think this album's deep cuts hit me quite as effectively as the singles. There are two deep cuts I did really like, on par with the singles. The second track, Echo and Bounce, with all its peppy bouncing beats and acid workouts, that was a lot of fun and flowed out of Take California pretty effectively. Also hearing this track made me realize how similar acid synths can sound to those, like 70s funk guitar licks. That's a really cool effect with that one. And penultimate track, Cominagetcha, returned to the same thick spy movie soundtrack formulas, but really delivered a sense of suspense and building tension with its orchestral samples that I thought worked really well. The other deep cuts, not really sure about some of these. Velvet Pants was the first track here where I started to feel like something was kinda off about the album as a whole, as I kinda described earlier with my restaurant experience. It does sound like it could have easily been released as a single. I think it technically was put out as like a one-off limited promo or something. And it does have a pretty neat jazzy sound to it with its lighter breaks and classy piano loops. To quote some of the samples that show up on this one, it's groovy, I guess. But I could never fully get on board with this one because I could only ever picture this track soundtracking a commercial or playing out of shopping mall speakers. It feels like the soundtrack to going out and spending a lot of money on hot, fashionable new clothes, and I couldn't imagine it in any other kind of context. I will give them credit for being kind of self-aware on that front and trying to be tongue-in-cheek with that title and the samples with some girls talking about this guy who's really proud of his new velvet pants, which are all he talks about. But it still feels too well-suited, no pun intended, to commercials for designer clothes to be the kind of thing I see myself specifically wanting to come back to. As someone who wears the exact same kinds of clothes every day and doesn't have much in the way of disposable income, this does not especially appeal to me. Beyond that, a lot of the other deep cuts just aren't all that interesting. There's kind of a light and breezy down-tempo trip-hop instrumental in Oh Yeah, which features all these samples of skateboarding. And I'm not gonna lie, I just thought this track sounded really dry and boring. The loop it's built on is kinda nice and chill and playful, but there's just nothing to it, and it just kinda drags on without anything interesting to pull me in. The American edition of the album replaces this cut with an alternate version featuring De La Soul, retitled 360 Degrees, Oh Yeah, which itself, I believe, was released as a single. And that version is infinitely better than the original album cut. It no longer feels like an awkward, empty space to fill time, and De La Soul fit perfectly with the instrumental while also giving the track so much more life and personality that it didn't have before. They were just the thing that this track absolutely needed. Said American version of the album also takes out the track Echo and Bounce, which I do not agree with, but it replaces it with You Want It Back, featuring the Jungle Brothers, a faster-paced straight hip-hop cut, which is plenty of fun in its own right. It's placed after Spybreak as the new album closer on that version, which honestly might even make more sense to finish things out pacing-wise. Spybreak may be the much stronger cut, but that feels more like a climax than a closer, and You Want It Back feels more like an actual closer. And it could go either way, I don't know. Anyway, there's a bunch of alright interludes scattered throughout. There's two slower 2-minute cuts called Better and Bigger. The former has some nice sample loops, and the latter has some pretty gritty, blaring acid synths going over some banging drums. But both of these still kind of feel like filler, as does the beatboxing on the 48-second interlude A Number of Microphones. And then there's also Winning Style, another longer, more down-tempo cut that, while containing more progression and sonic variety than Oh Yeah, still similarly feels oddly empty and like it's just kind of filling up time without doing anything interesting in its own right. Tracks like these feel like they were added in to break up the sound of the project and add more variety to allow the singles to hit that much harder, but I don't think they actually do this album any favors as a complete whole. Like, they just kind of drag things out unnecessarily. Compare this to the classics from the same era, like, again, Dig Your Own Hole and You've Come a Long Way Baby. The former of those fires on all cylinders from start to finish without any major breathers, and the latter designed every single track to stand on its own as single material. And sure, those albums have their less interesting moments too, but they don't feel like they have filler in the same obvious way that this one does, and are much more consistently engaging listening experiences as a result. So I suppose it is a good thing that we have that bonus second disc for the 20th anniversary reissue. While this is obviously just a collection of random B-sides and not the kind of thing directly designed to work as like an album or an extension of such in its own right, most of these B-sides are actually pretty solid, and I feel like if you replace some of those less interesting filler moments on the main album with a few of these cuts, you'd end up with something that does land in properly great territory for me. Now sure, this disc has its weaker moments too. Ron's Theory has a lot of interesting progressions, but kind of a sluggish groove behind it that isn't all that attention-grabbing. Clying has some especially thick bass lines and some okay one-note piano loops, but doesn't really offer anything else of note. Bring Us Together is plenty of fun with its slicker breakbeats and Alfred Hitchcock-esque string samples, but feels like a less engaging companion to Cominagetcha with an anticlimactic fade-out at the end. Alex Gifford attempts to rap himself on Prop's Vote of Gratitude to exactly as successful results as you'd expect, i.e. not very good. And there's two extra alternate versions of History Repeating, one of which is like all drum and bass-like, and one of which is kind of more down-tempo. Neither of which are better than the version on the main album. But you also got the propulsive acid grooves of Dive and Big Dog, the absolutely obliterating and crashing beats and whirring alarm synths of Lethal Cut, the mysterious jazz and orchestral loops of Go Faster going over slowed down maybe amen breaks, which add up to like the only genuinely great regular down-tempo cut I've heard from these guys. It's also got the above-mentioned 360 Degrees Oh Yeah with De La Soul and You Want It Back with the Jungle Brothers. Again, both were positive additions to the American version of the album. And it ends with Crash, another cut in the vein of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which takes an orchestral piece, in this case, At the Sign of the Swinging Cymbal by Brian Fahey, aka the theme tune to BBC Radio 1's Pick of the Pops, and turns that into another hard-hitting, if markedly less sprawling, big beat epic that ended up getting used in the soundtrack of an Austin Powers movie. Because of course it was. Not saying all of these needed to be on the album proper, but I would not at all mind switching a bunch of those weaker album cuts out with these. But yeah, I think that's everything I have to say on the topic of the Propellerheads. The original Decks and Drums and Rock and Roll on its own, I think personally comes up short of true greatness. It's a bit bogged down by uninteresting filler, and it is very dated. 1998 is pretty much the only year this could have come out, and every musical element on it sounds pretty trendy for that specific time without ever quite rising to the untouchable quality of other big beat classics from that era. It's why I'm kind of okay with the fact that the Propellerheads never came back after this. They would have felt really behind the times in the landscape of electronic music pretty much any time after they disbanded. And I'm not sure how you follow something like this up without going full Crystal Method and slowly losing the plot over time. But I do think there is the potential for a classic in here. While I don't think I'm keeping this album in its original form, like I said, if I make my own custom track listing out of the best tracks and the best B-sides, I could end up with an album that lands in 8.3 to 8.5 out of 10 territory. I do think the whole, James Bond theme angle they went with was pretty unique and something they could call their own, if a bit of a novelty. And they had so many bangers to go around that I could see myself coming back to if I'm in that big beat kind of mood. The way it currently is, though, while it's not great, it is still very good. I would totally get it if you held it up as an all-time favorite, and as you can tell from the fact that I wanted to make this video on it out of nowhere, I can definitely co-sign it as being worth your time to listen to as well. I'll give it a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.